Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our February Ranching 101 session. I know people are still joining. It's just right at 1 o'clock, but we will go ahead and get started with a few announcements. My name is Emily Lochner and I'm the Director of Engagement and Education here at Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers. Just a few quick updates before we jump into our presentation for the day. Our next Ranching 101 session is going to be Tuesday, March 16th at 1 p.m. For those of you who are interested, it's going to be the topic of grass and forage identification and implementation, identifying grasses that are prominent in different parts of the state, if they're beneficial to your cattle, if they're beneficial to soil health, and if other grasses should be introduced into your pasture or rangeland. That's going to be hosted. The speaker is going to be Dr. Vanessa Corriher Olson. She's with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension as the State Forage Extension Specialist. Those of you may also know our TSCRA convention, Cattle Raisers Convention and Expo did get moved this year. It will be hosted July 23rd through 25th in Fort Worth. And so be on the lookout for emails coming in early to mid-April for registration for that event if you'd like to join us on site in Fort Worth for the Cattle Raisers Convention and Expo. For those of you who have questions, you can see at the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A box and also a chat box. Feel free to post your questions there and ask them live. And for those of you who have any questions, if you're watching this recording or later, you can always email us membership@tscra.org. With that, we will go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce our speaker for the day. That's Scott Williamson. He's our Director of Law Enforcement and Brand and Inspection Services here at the Cattle Raisers, and he oversees the team of special rangers that many of you may work with. Anytime you need help, if something is stolen or goes missing, your local special ranger would be the first person that you would get into contact with after your sheriff. So Scott, I'll turn it over to you and I'll let you talk a little about the history of our special rangers and what you all do.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here with y'all. I'm sure ready to be face to face. I've had about all of the computer screen that I can stand over the last year, nearly a year and a half now. But I'm sure the largest part of y'all are familiar with who I am and my background, but I'll expound on that just a little bit to give you an idea. I've been with the association now in March, 34 years. Was a brand inspector, graduated, interestingly enough, with her tied to the next meeting. I was a range and wildlife management major at ACU. We farm and ranch, became a special ranger in 95, has served 25 years, commissioned by DPS and the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, as well supervised all of Oklahoma at one point, as well as the Texas Panhandle. We run a wheat and Stafford cattle operation in the north of Abilene. So I have had the opportunity to be a part of the industry all the way through from the market and producer and the investigative side as well. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. We're going to go through kind of a broad spectrum of things. So, if you have questions, feel free to send those through the chat. A little bit about our history. It's something I've really enjoyed since I've been in this role, is looking back. Most everybody knows that we were founded in Graham in 1877. And that our primary purpose was livestock identification and theft investigation. And the way that rolled through, that we worked with Texas Rangers, first with sheriff's departments, and realized we didn't have enough venue, and then with the Texas Rangers, and then having our appointments as special rangers. We still operate today, and then our men in Oklahoma are commissioned by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation as rangers. 30 of us scattered over both states. You'll see just in a minute a map of the way those lay out. And, you know, if you have a theft that you need to report, you will contact the special ranger from your area directly. You don't have to contact our office and go through the headquarters. The thing we bring to the table over your local sheriff's department, we do not want to minimize the authority or the quality of your local investigators. But agricultural investigation is specific because of the industry and the commerce, the way that those channels work, the mobility of cattle, where they may be sold anywhere in the United States, but particularly over a 2 or 3 or 4 state region. And the networking that needs to take place between different counties with arrests or searches needing to take place in different venues that would, with a local law enforcement, would require them to have that officer from that other venue to work on that case. So we're fluid in the fact that anywhere in Texas or Oklahoma, we can go work on that investigation directly. Although we will work with the sheriffs and often do with many other agencies, we're not required to have that to go forward with an investigation. And the one thing that I'm not a salesman by any means and don't ever want to be, but the special rangers are funded solely by your memberships. We receive no state funding. Actually, my special ranger foundation that we'll talk about in a little bit is where all of our training and equipment comes from. There's not even any of that in our cattle raisers budget. All of our investigators are seasoned livestock investigators, our criminal investigators. We have them from that were captains in the Parks and Wildlife as game wardens. We have Texas Rangers, a lieutenant with Texas Rangers, many chief deputies or investigators from all different investigative backgrounds. There's over 900 years of investigative experience just within our 30 special rangers. The duties that we hold are not only criminal investigation, and it is still not necessarily understood that we don't, that we investigate anything agricultural based, not just livestock. So felony crimes that could deal with tractors, trailers, hay, fraud, internet, false identity, bank frauds are all investigations that we take part in. We work with sheriffs for strays, helping them identify, although the stray law is actually designated by legislation to the authority of the sheriff, and we don't have authority to intervene other than helping him to identify those animals. We supervise our market inspectors and then work emergency management as liaisons with state agencies in disaster situations. Our strengths lie, though, in our networking with other agencies across North America. We are heavily involved in Southern and Western States Livestock Investigators, International Livestock Identification Association. And this office will weekly interact with some other state or country working in agricultural crime. Is talking about key law enforcement partners. While we do work as a self-sufficient agency, we have a strong working relationship with DPS, Parks and Wildlife, the Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, and then these other investigative agencies across the United States. Emergency management, we've taken in the last 10 years an increasing role working as a landowner liaison with these different agencies of the Forest Service, Animal Health Commission, or the Texas Department, DPS Emergency Management, and helping be a person to bridge the gap with a livestock producer, for instance, in a fire or winter storm, Goliath, or a hurricane. where your personal land or property is affected and the state may be trying to take rulings or actions that are contrary to something you know to be good management to salvage grass or livestock. So we can act as a direct contact to mediate that conversation so that those outcomes have the best potential. These were Panhandle fires pictures when we burned 1 million off of the Panhandle in 2007. And that year that we had all of those major fires is when our role really began to increase. The hurricanes of South Texas. As I spoke, we are privately funded with no state fundings. And so the Texas Ranger, the Special Ranger Foundation, if you attended our convention, you've seen the silent auction. This is now a subset of the Special Ranger Foundation. We created a 501c3. So the monies that come into that are completely responsible for all of the training and equipment that we use going forward. Some of the things that the Special Rangers have accomplished in just the last 2 years, we're taking a stronger role at modernizing much of our equipment and our standards. ORI is just simply the official identification of an agency within the system used to enter stolen property, the official crime information and radio network. And we worked as a subset of many years of using sheriff's departments, ORIs, or some other agencies. So we have been recognized by the FBI as a subset of the DPS Texas Rangers with our own ORI for the first time in our history since 1877. We've created an MOU with the DPS on our communications so that we can operate with, we're using new radios. We've raised the money and implemented about half of those. We've got about half left so that we will be able to communicate under the DPS communication system. We have just completed certifications so that we can utilize DPS analyst, intelligence, fusion center for our backgrounding and information for our investigations, which is a strong tool that we have not always had access to. We've changed our standards to match that of the Texas Rangers with our firearms above and beyond what state licensing requirements are. We've matched that as well with our physical readiness training. HIFACs are simply trauma first aid kits, and all of the Special Rangers have now trained with that and carry those HIFACs, not only for their safety, but all of those around them or members if they're on the ranch or working in any other circumstance where that could be an issue. We are currently putting together CSI kits, not quite as capable as what they show on TV, where in 15 seconds we can know everybody's history from the children's names to what their credit card was used for. But for crime scenes that we can draw late fingerprints, take castings, and whatever we might need to have a stronger crime scene evidence base. We're going to go through the same training as the Texas Rangers and DPS, and we're going to issue those kits this summer to every one of the Special Rangers. We've updated equipment with mobile cell phone boosters, cameras, body armor, go bags, binoculars, and really working to give the skills and to hire the new Special Rangers that are ready for today's challenges in our investigation. When I started 25 years ago, we were writing on a yellow tablet and had a roll of quarters to stop at a courthouse and use the payphone to call into the office. Well, all of these advancements in technology have also caused for our investigations to have need to excel at that same rate. We have to understand electronic investigations. We have to have better tools. We have to have better intelligence and investigative skills and programs. So that is one of the major goals that we have in the coming years, is to remain the cutting edge investigators that our history since 1877 has asked us to be, and we're working to fulfill that. You see the body armor, we have now all 30 special rangers in new body armor. This is just one of the trainings where we were actually doing all the hands-on on our IFAC training. I will get to what you're really here for, the ag crime overview, and we'll go through some background before we start the theft prevention. What is ag crime? So many times it gets blocked into just a stolen cow or a stolen horse. And the livestock is a major issue, and in our most common, but any agricultural property, from four-wheelers, many times it's even guns or property stolen out of pickups, ranch houses. I did have the scenario once where they stole a bunch of saddles and bridles out of the barn and backed right across the lawn and took the air conditioner out of the window of the ranch house. It was kind of interesting. We identified our suspect, arrested him, recovered the saddles and bridles, and asked him about the air conditioner, and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." So I said, "Well, we're fixing to run a search warrant on your house. We're going to take you with us. Anything now you want to tell us?" "No." So we go to the back door of his house and open this sliding glass door and step in. The air conditioner sitting there in the middle of the room. The guy that was not just high on the intelligence level looked over his shoulder at myself and the sheriff and said, "I guess my roommate went back and got that." And I assume he really believed that I would buy that. But so it's been all sorts of property that we've worked. We will work with the sheriff's departments if it's something out of our league, not necessarily out of our league, but just out of our obligation by law to work to fulfill that the best we can. We are getting more and more demand for identity, crimes of deception, wire, internet fraud, and organized crime. Rural crime, ag crime is here to stay, and it's going to be an increasing problem, I believe, because of the nature of rural America. As rural population moves to urban areas, it leaves some low-income housing opportunities where criminals can move in and set up, from narcotics to property trafficking. They can be in a place that is easy for them to stay hidden. They're pretty sure that law enforcement have limited budgets and numbers, so they're not going to have likelihood of as many law enforcement officers looking over their shoulder. The one I would warn you to watch for the most is the con man. He can be the most devastating. Instead of stealing and selling 2 or 3 cows or a handful of calves, he may come in and, through very convincing conversation, get a lease on land or property, or buying cattle from you, or something that gives him access to much, if not all, of your income for that year. So you have to be very cautious to background and make sure you contact the special ranger and find out who this person is, and make sure you know and take the time to background. Don't take for granted. My dad had a statement that large second sounds don't come from people you didn't like or trust. And the fact of the matter is that con men are con men because they can portray that role. They can make you think that they are the nicest, most grace-filled person not at all uncommon. Multiple times I've had these type of con men asked to pray or quote scripture in the making of their trade for your purchase or your lease. So although that's not always bad, do take that as a sign. My first interview in interrogation school, the instructor held a Bible in one hand and rosary beads in the other hand and said, when they hold these up, they did it. Although I'll be the first to admit that God is a perfect covering, he also is used as a cover by thieves many times. So just be aware of that. Criminal accessibility to agriculture. In working with the FBI, Homeland Security, they are often dumbfounded that there's this much agricultural crime. And when you look at it in these terms, that 170 billion in US GDP, 3.5% of the world's GDP is agriculture, there's a tremendous opportunity for thieves, particularly these con men and online thieves, to work. So just be aware of that. And they have now learned and understand that and are trying to take advantage of it. Also, lack of understanding in the financial industry, or even in the, as we'd say, the act of God avenue of, you send your cattle to a backgrounding yard and ask them to give Draxxin. Depending on the weight of the calf, you could be easily looking at $20, maybe even $25 a head. You send 1,000 head of cattle in there and they say they did, and they didn't. So they pocketed $25,000, and you have a death loss above what you expected, as well as a medicine bill if they did try to correct that problem. So there are a lot of ways that that they can steal from you without actually having to cut a lock and have a trailer. Give you an idea, these are 18 statistics. I haven't updated this slide, but it holds pretty true. We're running from 40 to 60 convictions a year. That's not cases filed. That's the ones that actually make it through the system to get a conviction. We're running actually above this, probably closer to 300 years incarceration. So take that into context. I get frustrated because I don't feel like I get good enough sentences many times. But just listen to the news and listen to the murderers and the multi-million-dollar frauds that get, 12 months, 18 months in the federal pen, 3 or 4, 5, 6 years, or 8 years. Actually, my best case was a fraud case, and the individual got 99 years that upheld through appeal. So we really do feel fortunate. Much of that's because Texas has strong laws and good prosecutors. This is an example of those. A state jail felony, you're talking about stealing a baby calf, and that's automatically a third-degree felony. So I've had a circumstance where they stole an $80 baby bottle calf, and we sent him to the pen for 8 years. So we are very blessed to have good legislators and, for the most part, good district attorneys and judges that respect the agriculture system in Texas. An important part of getting those good convictions, and this is where you can play a role in, if you have relationships with district attorneys or judges or legislators, helping them to understand that it's not one head of livestock that we're talking about here. A hindering a secured creditor costs all producers. It changes everybody's demands as far as to how much money they can borrow and how that's going to be managed by the lending institutions. So it is truly a crime that affects everybody that is a producer that relies on lending, which is pretty well all of them that I know. You know, feeder yearlings, the theft is one thing, but the loss of the profit that that animal, the gain loss that you are expecting off of that animal are added dollars that we have learned to pencil in. And when we file for restitution, not only is it a $750 calf, in the circumstance of a cow, let's just say that lifespan of that cow is 10 calves, and you're talking about a $750 calf, and now you're talking about likely $1,000, then that theft of that one cow was actually a $7,500 impact to that producer. We have had success now at using this for our restitution figure and in sentencing guidelines. But they have to understand what the true impact of a livestock theft and not try to equate it to somebody stealing your motorcycle, because they're stealing the factory from our producers, not just stealing some byproduct. And then breeding stock, you've got hard-fought genetics. As we talked about, theft is everything from livestock, all agriculture related, and all equipment. Banking, agriculture, missing collateral, hindering a secured creditor, embezzlement, false statement to obtain credit conversion. Those are cases we'll work for banks, but occasionally between partners, these become relevant too. And while I'm on that statement, be very careful of partnerships. You need to really understand who you're dealing with, because the majority of the time, the courts will not recognize partnerships as crimes. They want to say that you have a contractual disagreement that can leave a good person in a real bind at being able to recover any of their property or finances. Financial float or kite scheme, false representation of payment, false representation of product detail, internet sales, internet schemes. These are all becoming much more popular for us to have to investigate. The internet has created a venue for people to sell cattle or buy cattle by video. I urge you to never do that if you don't know exactly who you're dealing with, or in my first off preference, if you can't go, have somebody go look at these. Use that as a starter point, but don't use it as what the animal is. First off, it is not uncommon in these cases that the video sent is not the cattle purchased. Or it may be that they intentionally swap those cattle. So make sure you know what you're getting. And then if there is a problem, refuse that immediately. If you receive a set of cattle and you don't like them, and you wait 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, and then one night you're frustrated about it, if you receive a bunch of bred cows and you don't know anything other than he said they're bred, then I would require a vet to immediately palpate all of those animals and make sure you know what you've got with age and breeding before you make payment and agree to accept those cattle. Not an uncommon call at all for us to have somebody that bought a truckload of cows off the internet from somebody they don't know, off a video, and turn them out, never think about it again. 6 months later, all of a sudden they realized only 3 of them calved and the rest of them were open. At that point, there's really nothing we can do. There's no way for us to prove that those cattle were open on that day and that something didn't happen in between. Organized crime is becoming a more important or more common issue to deal with. in agricultural crime as we work with Aryan Brotherhood cases, cartel cases. I had a case where they got into a ranch house and they got some guns along with some other property. Those guns were long-range, high-end rifles and one pistol. And the gentleman remembered everything about those serial numbers, even remembered what kind of ammunition was loaded, to the point that the pistol he knew was loaded with 2 rounds of one type of ammunition and the rest another. When I ran out of leads, I worked with the ATF, gave them that information. And interestingly enough, in about 2 weeks, they ran a raid on a cartel headquarters in the Metroplex. And those guns were there, and we worked together going back and found that the Aryan Brotherhood in Wichita Falls had orchestrated a ring that was sending local dopers out to the field to steal guns and property, but primarily guns was their focus, and bring them back to this headquarters. And they were trading a little bit of cash and dope to those men, and they were bundling that up and taking it to the cartel in the Metroplex and trading it for more cash and more dope. And then they were bundling it up and sending it back to Old Mexico for the main wars. So it's amazing how the things can tie together today in what, when I began 25 years ago, would have never even been contemplated. Narcotics more and more is becoming something that is just a mainstay in any of these larger crimes, and a lot of the smaller ones, they're stealing just so that they can buy. But a large percentage of our thefts of any size have some tie back at some level to narcotics. Pretty well what we've already talked to relative to those. Criminal versus civil. Talk about that just a minute. We often get calls and people are frustrated that we can't help them, and it's frustrating to us that we can't help them. But there is a difference in what is civil law and criminal law, and we can't get involved by statute into civil law. We can't advise for civil law. And here is an example that is frustrating, but is a fact. I had an individual that was a criminal, a con man, going around and finding people who had pretty nice horses to sell. One individual had a team roping horse, wanted, I don't remember now, $7,500, $10,000 for the horse. And the guy said, I'm headed to California. I can get $15,000 for this. You know, if you'll give me $5,000, I can get you $10,000 for him, and I'll pay the haul, and I'll get him out there. The guy says, great. Gives him permission, gives him the papers, sends it out there, never hears from him again. Well, the gentleman had sold the horse, kept all the money. We went to the district attorney and tried to file cases, and he said, no. He said, this is civil because you willingly loaded this horse, gave him permission to sell it, gave him, that's exemplified by the papers, and gave him a portion of ownership in that value of that animal. So you can get an attorney and sue him for that, but we can't file criminal charges. Very likely that any type of attorney work would have been fruitless, and it would have cost as much or more probably than the value of the horse. So that's an example of a situation that is a civil that's very frustrating, and there was no doubt that there was wrongdoing. There's no doubt that there was intent. But by the structure of the law, it didn't allow us to file criminal charges. I've had a member frustrated with a similar circumstance and made the comment, you know, I'm a member, you work for me. And while we'll do everything in our power to help our members, we are also legislated because of our state commissions to work for every citizen of Texas or Oklahoma. And our main obligation, our only obligation, is to uphold the Texas and Oklahoma laws. So outside of that scope, we have no authority. So there are times that it is very frustrating because we know something happened or we think something happened, but because of the structure of the law and the restraints that we have to work under within those, you know, there is nothing we can do about it at that time. So just understand that if there is no outcome, it's not always because we didn't do our job or we didn't want to. The constraints that we are required by law to work under don't always allow us to do what we would like to do. We have Operation Cow Thief. This is also funded out of our Special Ranger Foundation, where we offer rewards for information, just essentially a agricultural crime stoppers. And we've been pretty blessed that that has stayed funded and that we have had a good bit of success with that. The only thing on this is wrong is don't save this number. It has just recently changed, and I will have them actually send that out in a news update because I don't have that number off the top of my head. One of the things you can do to secure your property, your ranch, your farm, your residence, is to know your operation, your employees, who's leasing from you or who you're leasing to, neighbors, and to know your cattle. And that sounds a little oversimplistic probably, but it's not at all uncommon for us to work on a theft. And when we ask about an employee, the first name that comes up is somebody we know is a felon, or we know to be dishonorable. Same with leasees and leaseors, and who neighbors are. Knowing your cattle, making sure they're marked and branded. We find it much less likely that somebody who understands their operation, keeps gates locked, is organized, know what they have, know where it's at, make regular visits there, and backgrounds those that they do business with. It's seldom that they have problems compared to a more likely scenario is a non-resident that goes into an area, buys a place. The first guy that comes up and offers to care for it, you know, is hired, and they don't know anything about them, but they don't background. And that leaves the door open that you could have the fox guarding the hen house, as they say. Good fences make good neighbors. I'm a firm believer that the vast majority of the cattle stolen are stolen after they get out of bad fences and bad gates, and they get to a location that somebody can steal them safely because they may be sometimes a mile or 2 miles from that property when they're actually taken, and we have no way of locating that crime scene to get that basic evidence. To give you a little idea of how far cattle can travel, how quickly, I had a circumstance where some cattle were put in a quarter section, had a gate down on the backside. Nobody knew it. They were put in there just before dark. At daylight the next morning, the individual went back to check on those cattle, and that gate was down. And we immediately, it was pretty open country, we immediately went to driving and looking for those cattle and found them 15 miles away, and it couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 hours from when they were turned out. And they were not at a run when we found them. They were just at a good long trot. So they can go, the scope of where they could be is much broader than most people usually allow themselves to believe. When Winter Storm Goliath came across the Panhandle, when that storm finished rolling through, a lot of that was hot wires, a lot of it snow built up to the point cattle could actually walk across the fences. There were some cattle that were located 70 miles south and a day and a half from where they originated. So never underestimate how far the cattle can go and what they would or wouldn't have gone through. I've heard that cattle have a third of the day they eat, a third of the day they sleep, and a third of the day they look for a way to get out or get in trouble. And I think that's probably pretty true. Taking the time to go above and beyond to be a good neighbor. Bad neighbors are a problem that I don't have an answer for you how to get around. It's not illegal to be a bad neighbor, but the harder you work at being a good neighbor, the more likely that scenario is to be favorable. The one thing about agriculture is it is a family event. We need neighbors, we need family to be looking over our shoulders. We need that crime watch mentality of all of us caring about everybody's property, the conditions of their cattle, and that will make you the safest possible operating environment. Lock gates, I hate lock gates, they aggravate me to death, but I can tell you they make a difference. Many criminals don't like to go into a place they've got to make it evident that they've been in, to leave evidence. But if they realize you don't go in and out of there, that it's not locked, that gates are left open, we even make it a priority to close and lock all of our gates in empty fields when nothing's there, just so everybody knows that we are aware of who's going in and out of there when. We find if we leave those gates open on roads, it's not uncommon to find a set of tire tracks where somebody, whether it was a pig hunter or just some random person driving around, just felt like, well, that's open. Since the gate's open, I have right to go in and drive in and out. I live on a private road with a sign that says private road, no entrance, no soliciting. And about twice a day, somebody drives in, and about half the time they honk and want to talk to me. And first thing my response is I guess I don't want to do business with anybody that can't read. But it did make me understand that if they have access to something, they will go in. And criminals were more likely, but that'll make a big difference if you'll just lock those gates. Watching your pins for traffic, watching if there's any sign that a gate's been locked or unlocked, cattle are left up in it, tire tracks, anything you can see. Be observant at what your operation is like day to day. When you see anything out of place, take the time to stop and ask your employee, call your neighbor, get a notebook and make notes of those things that are out of place, what the date and time is on those. Often when we work a case and we start into one and we start talking to neighbors, we may uncover that there were 10 or 12 or 15 more thefts in that area that we ended up informing the victims that they were offended against before they knew it. And then once they started having that conversation, many times they'll come back and say, I remember seeing this. I remember this happening. Some of them even say, I talked to this guy, but he gave me a good story and I didn't even think about it. And all of those bits and pieces would have given us a stronger story to convict or maybe even make cases we wouldn't have made. So those bits and pieces that don't seem significant to you are often significant to us when they're all put together in that piece of the puzzle. Make sure that you have that you brand your livestock, ear tag them. Ear tags alone can be cut out, but I am a firm believer in ear tags, brands, and earmarks. The culmination of all of these pieces give a strong proof of ownership brand is the only permanent means in Texas of ownership. Tattoos change. There are some things you can do to make a permanent tattoo, but a brand is recognized in case law as being the license plate for that animal. So if you think about it in the fact of your white Ford pickup is stolen and you call me and say, I'm missing a white Ford pickup, it's somewhere in Texas. The chance of me finding that are zero. If you call me and say, my white Ford vehicle with license plate this, serial number this, now I can identify that. As well, any of your property, use your driver's license number. Make sure to preface it with the state, Texas TX, and then your 8 digits. That is quickly recoverable by any law enforcement anywhere in the United States. They can run that driver's license number and find out who that driver's license belongs to, contact you. I have recovered in pawn shop saddles. One time I go back and called a guy that I saw his saddle in a pawn shop. I called him and asked him if he had a saddle like this, and he said, yes, sir. And I asked him where it was. He said, it's in my tack room. I said, would you mind going out there and looking? He came back in out of breath, and he said, it's gone. They stole it. And I said, yes, sir, they did. I've got it. But I would have not been able to put that together, and may or may not have ever located that saddle. It may have been sold and off on a ranch somewhere by the time he realized that it was actually missing. To get information into the NCIC, TCIC, the Information Crime Center, we have to have specific identification. It's got to have serial numbers, something that can give me the specifics for that to disseminate it from some other object. If it's a shotgun or rifle, I've got to have that serial number. Just saying I've got a Marlin 22-250 is not going, they're not going to allow me to put that into that. Of course, photographs are always important. And I suggest on guns or significant property and saddles, write that information down, take pictures of it, print it, and just put it in a folder and drop it in your safe or in your files, so that if something happens, then you can immediately pull all that. I would also suggest ledgering all your serial numbers and descriptions and make, model number, year number, tractors, trailers, any significant property like that. I'll go through this pretty quick. And making a theft report, we're going to need those detailed descriptions and investigations. We're going to have to be able to identify it to recover. We have to have a good description on the livestock to be able to not only to recover, but to send out a search list. If I'm asking somebody in Colorado to look for a black cow, I need to be able to describe that one in a way that he can be positive of what he is, and I'll have to have that before he can make a seizure on that animal. The more clearly you can identify those animals, it makes it easier for neighbors to realize that they've got one of your animals, or a stray situation, to establish ownership. If the sheriff ends up with one impounded that had been out on the road or something, it gives him quick and clear information on how to get that animal back to its owner. There's lots of different identifiers. Look at this hoof. That is a strong identifier for that animal. If you are writing down the brand or taking a picture of that horse to put back in your files, take a picture of that foot, because that's not going to change. And that would be significant permanent identification if I'm trying to seize an animal that has been stolen. Brands, make sure that they're clear and concise. I'll be glad to talk to any of y'all if you ever have any questions on branding, but that they are simple and clear and 4 inches roughly on an adult animal is very important. As we've talked about, they are strong theft deterrents, and they are permanent ID. Freeze brand is registered in the same way, and it is the same value of ownership identification as a fire brand. I don't know if this is going to let me do that. Not recommended way to brand. I just threw that one in there when I saw that. We used to fire brand some horses, and it can be a little dangerous if you don't have a good set of stocks and know what you're doing. Talking about brands, go through this pretty quick. I'm not necessarily dealing with theft. If you have an Astray on you and you're trying to see what that brand is, they hair over often. If you get it in the chute, you can put a little water on top of it, get to where the sunlight is, and then you know, the most difficult is just to shear it. But those are all ways that you can identify that brand a little easier. What do you call a brand? If you're reporting a theft, my suggestion is to draw it out, or trace the iron out, take a picture of it, and send it to the special ranger, because as you can see here, just telling me it's an R on the left hip could be vastly different. Horses' papers are not proof of ownership. They're not title. They are identification, and AQHA will tell you this. I've been to court in a case where we had a stolen horse, and I said, you know, but the papers are still registered in this man's name. And AQHA stood up quickly and said, there is no requirement to transfer or to register a horse. Therefore, that is only identification, and we take no claim as to who actually owns that horse. Just food for thought as you're going forward. Earmarks. Think about what kind of earmark you want to use and stay consistent with it. There's all sorts of earmarks, whether it's the hog cutters that are round or triangular, large or small, hand cut, the location. Just something that you can be consistent with. And my suggestion is to record it with the brand when you re-register brands. Ear tags, there's all sorts of ear tags. Put your information on there. Obviously with today's RFID, there are probably a lot of people going to an RFID 840 type tag that have the dangle part of it as well, that may have a number on it, but also put your name and phone number. That simplifies getting these animals home when something happens. And sometimes it's not, you can do a great job with your fences and caring for them. Natural disasters, wind blowing a tree over on a fence, a flood knocking out you know, water gaps or whatever it may be. There are things that are out of your control that allow these cattle to get out and roam, particularly if you operate around a river. This picked up, we're going to go through that pretty quick. It picked up, I think I opened another PowerPoint that had a bunch of investigative tag number information in it. Tattoos, the only thing I say about tattoos is the only way they are of any account is if I know they're there and I've got them in a chute to use them as ID after the fact. I've got to be able to see and identify what I am using to recover that animal. And only once in my career have I been able to utilize successfully a tattoo as ID. These are some different, we talked about the serial numbers already, and using the driver's license, locking up your trailers, making sure you get the serial numbers. Different ways you can unpin your crank is a way to secure those, particularly if you're on a roadway or a rural area or an urban area. or at a horse show. Those are all ways that you can help secure those property. Your accurate and detailed list that we were talking to, take keys out of tractors that are in a area that would be easily accessed. If you leave a tractor up moving hay and you leave it on the side of the road, they can still get in and start those. They can have tractor keys as well. They can hot wire them, but anything you can do to make them have to spend more time makes them less likely to steal that property. Watch for signs when you go into your property. If you see those tire tracks, if you see a gate cut, if you see anything out of line, don't go in to see what happened. If you see something that piques your suspicion like that, call us, call the sheriff's department, let somebody come in who can preserve any evidence. If it's nothing, the neighbor drove in and borrowed a trailer and took it back and forgot to call, that's no problem. I'd much rather deal with that than I had have a good case that the evidence was destroyed or compromised so that I wasn't able to utilize it to make a case. Talking about suspects, think about, you know, who has knowledge, who could have been in your property, who did you have some kind of argument, who would have felt like maybe they owed you something. While there are many, many thefts that happen from people just driving across the country, it is also not uncommon for those to be from family members to friends to locals to past employees. So when you realize that something doesn't seem right, begin to run through your mind and don't take for granted that you just don't know anybody that would ever do anything. And you've got to, whether it's us, whether it's your sheriff, whether it's a deputy, whether it's a game warden, in that circumstance, you've got to have somebody you can confide in with those names that you don't want to throw a stone at, you don't want to say might be guilty, but if it raised a suspicion in your mind, then you need to make that known, because just you never know who that could have been. I'm going to skip down through a bunch of this. Pardon me, this is picked up out of one I didn't. Okay, here's what I want to get to right now. Brand inspection. We have about 70 brand inspectors that are at every public market. This information for each head of livestock is recorded and put into our computerized database. I'll go through this pretty quick. This is a completed F1, just a test when we had it, the way that looks when it leaves a brand inspector and comes into our office. Every brand, every mark is coded and put into a system. We are currently actually going to this system here, a new electronic system, so that everything will be onto a Surface Pro, loaded immediately and searchable by all special rangers immediately. Going back to how far we've progressed, these are actually 3 case reports, the way they logged them in the Fort Worth office when I went to work. Those are all 3 some of my cases to where we've gone. That was my first brand book that I carried in the field. It had been carried by Manfred Elliott 30 years before me. And so now all of that is done electronic. 1963, when Don King took over as the director of law enforcement, general manager of cattle raisers, he put in the first microfiche system that we still somewhat use today. It's what we call our electronic system. And so I was Don King's last hire, so it's kind of ironic that now I'm the one putting in the cloud-based internet inspection system. One of our brand inspectors at Abilene putting in the test system. We'll be able to search from these new systems and it'll be immediately accessible. So if you carry cattle at Abilene auction, when that sale's over an hour later, that's accessible by all 30 of the special rangers. We hope by the end of the year to have the full state implemented into this new system. And at that point, we'll be able to flag brands or cattle or consigners and have real-time access to all of those sales for Texas averages about 3.5 to 6.5 million head inspected or sold through a public market each year. And this will give us access to all those records immediately. Brand registration, re-registration begins this fall. The 30th of August, 2021, whatever brand you have, you must go in. You've got a 6-month window to go into your county clerk's office in the county that brand is registered and re-register that brand. And it will be good from that point for 10 years. If you're a new producer and you've got to register a brand, remember Texas, the law says that if you're going to brand an animal with a brand, it must be registered in the county that animal is going to reside. So if you need to register one now for a new set of cattle going into a new county, realize that will only be valid until the end of August. And then you will re-register it, and then it will be good for a 10-year period. So anytime you register a brand, the registration periods are the first odd year of each decade. So 21, 31, and any time in between, it'll automatically expire at that universal date. We are actually working right now with the Texas County and District Clerks Association, building an electronic platform. If you've ever looked at tscrabrands.com, that was the repository for all of the county's brands in the state of Texas, which are sent to us after they're registered in that county. That system is outdated, and we are building a new one that will allow people to go online and register a brand or re-register a brand remotely. If you've ever registered a vehicle on Texas, the Department of Transportation, DMV, where you go into that site, you pick Hood County and you put in your information to re-register a vehicle. And then that money and that application is actually routed directly to that county, and then they mail you print a receipt, and then they mail you your registration form. That is very similar to what we are working on right now with the brand registration. Since any county that you put those cattle in requires that registration, if you produce in 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 counties, then you currently have to go in person to each one of those counties and make that application independently. And this would allow you to go one place online and do that from your office or home. So we have high hopes for that. And as well, then that will serve as the repository, and it will have varying levels or layers of access so that the county clerk has ultimate access over the management of those files. The owner of that brand then could access it and update his contact information on that. Law enforcement would have access to it with contact information. For working estrays or theft, they would have one computerized database to go back and pull those queries from, and then the special rangers would also have that statewide access with all the contact information. But it's important to remember that that registration will take place essentially from September 1st for 6 months. And at the last of that 6 months, if you have not re-registered your brand, it's up for grabs for the first person in. First person, first come, first serve can take your brand, even if it's been in your family 100 years. So don't take that for granted and push it down the road so that you take a chance at forgetting to register that brand. And a few livestock facts from the state of Texas, just to kind of give you a perspective of our industry. Texas is first in cattle inventory and production. In Texas, cattle revenue is only second to petroleum. About 14 million cattle in the state of Texas and about 1 million horses. And there's over 102,000. There's about 135,000 registered brands in the state of Texas. That's the old form, and it will be a new electronic form. We've talked about most of these. The significance of registering that brand. First, it's mandated by law. It is the permanent identification, and you will need that brand registration to prove up in criminal and civil and Australia law that is your brand and rightfully registered to you. That is also used in combination with RFID for animal disease traceability. Think back about the mad cow, Texas Animal Health Commission, USDA, APHIS. All of it is utilizes the brand as part of that permanent ID. Collateral identification for agricultural lending, and I think that you're going to see a significant increase in that in the coming years as a demand. So just be prepared for that. These are all brand registrations. A few questions. These are actually from a clerk's conference, but how is the ownership of a brand transferred after death? A brand is personal property. So it is transferred in a will just the same as a car or a pickup or any other real property. It can be transferred by affidavit from a family member to another family member at any time. Minors can have registered brands, although it will take somebody from the family to sign the affidavit for it. Whose records constitute legal record? The clerk's office is the legal record for a brand registration. And if accidentally, which does happen, two brands get registered in the same county, the same brand in the same location, that record on the timeline, the first one registered will be considered the owner of that brand. And as well, that brand location is a specific part of that brand. So an R on the left hip, an R on the left rib, and an R on the left shoulder, all three different brands. That both components go together to identify what that brand is. And then the brand may also be rejected even if it's too similar. For instance, if somebody is branding a 5 on the left hip, somebody else is branding an S on the left hip, when those actually burn out or cure, they very well may look so similar, particularly if they burn out, that they could cause issue, and a clerk has the right to deny that. Even though they're different, they are too similar to secure ownership without question. And with that, I will be willing to take any questions or discussion you might have.
Scott, we've had a few questions come in as you were talking, so I'll just ask them in the order that they came in. One of the first question was, what participation does the Special Rangers now have in regards to the bailouts in LaSalle County? Do the Rangers get updates daily from custom agents? Could you talk a little bit about that?
As far as explain, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about as far as the bailout.
If whoever asked that question will give a little more information in the chat, then we can get that answered. Okay, while we're waiting for that response, do you use DNA testing at all for identification of stolen livestock when ownership is not evident?
Yes, we do. We have utilized, and we have several access to labs to utilize DNA, and had some very successful cases. Matter of fact, the $80 calf that I talked about, the gentleman got 8 years, that was actually a bottle calf. And it was one of my cases. And a witness saw and described a vehicle that pulled up in a winter day next to a hay bale on the county road, reached under the fence and pulled a little bottle calf out, threw it in the front seat, closed the door. And after a good bit of time, we located the vehicle, and they had washed it out and cleaned it out. You could tell, except for, and this will date myself as well as the pickup. If everybody remembers the old crushed velour door panels on the Chevrolet vehicles, and it was a blue crushed velour door panel, and we pulled 9 hairs out of that door panel and were able to DNA match it back against the Siren Dam and get a positive identification. We actually never even located the calf after that point. So yes, that is something we utilize if needed.
Thanks for that, Scott. Next question. What about brucellosis tags, numbers, and tattoos? Do you ever use brucellosis tags as identification?
That's a great question. And yes, and we used them a lot. Matter of fact, when I first started was in the mandatory brucellosis period, and those records were kept by the state, and all the tracking records were kept by the state, and we could run those reports and find out. And I've actually made cases where we took brucellosis tag records and went back to our statute of limitations 5 years. Actually, when I very first went to work, one of my first cases was reported out of Dickens County, and I had been prior to that the brand inspector at Sweetwater. And he said, you know, I never got any satisfaction on this. Can you look into it again? And it had been 5 years of statute of limitations, and we were right up against that. And I did some looking, and actually through the brucellosis tags, we ran down and I had done the brand inspection on those cattle. So my last cattle, first cattle to work a case on, I had actually been the brand inspector, and we used brucellosis tags and ran down all of those cattle and made a conviction on that case. Very common. We've lost that now that we don't have the brucellosis tag anymore. So with that, going back to, I was talking about legislators, we've got the RFID tag system that now it looks like it's coming into play and will be. One of the things that the USDA and the government have pushed is that the Privacy Act will only allow that to be utilized in an animal disease traceback emergency. I firmly disagree with that because we work closely with the RCMP in Canada, who have dealt with this mandatory tagging for many, many years. And their producers will tell you that that's the biggest mistake they made, that they can't even return a stray cow based off of those numbers in Canada. So I would push that as we go forward with RFID programs, that it have use as an investigative tool for law enforcement. I think that is probably the most valid use of it.
Good information, Scott. Our next question, if we have wild or feral cattle on our property that we would like to gather and sell, do we need to contact the special ranger in our area or the sheriff's department? What is the right way to establish that these cattle are feral and do not belong to anyone? They're unbranded and they're not descendants of our cattle or our neighbor's cattle.
Great question, and that one can be very difficult to answer. There is no such thing as feral cattle in the state of Texas. All cattle are deemed owned by somebody, and if they are unknown, then they are automatically owned by the county in which they reside. The reason this is, there is no finders keepers if nobody claims it. And the reason for that is it became a legal way to steal many, many years ago, that they would go out and gather the unmarked cattle off somebody, bring them home. Nobody could claim them, and then they could sell them, and they had legally committed theft. So I'm going to back up and kind of give a quick review of the estray law to help make this maybe a little more clear. Is when you have those cattle that you're calling feral, actually the term is estray, then those are by law to be reported to the sheriff or to the sheriff's department in that county. We often work with them, but we are not their designee. That is legislated by the sheriff. If you don't get a response, let us know, and we will work to help identify those. And before you do that, you're welcome to contact us, and we'll come look and see if we can see a brand or identifier, or maybe working a missing report that could identify those cattle. At that point, by Texas law, you have 5 days when you see cattle that aren't yours on your property to report those cattle. After that, it actually, by the letter of the law, could be deemed theft. I have filed and convicted a gentleman who was going onto the river and catching these, quote, feral cattle, and they belonged to landowners on either side. He was just simply catching the ones that weren't branded and selling them. And in his statement to me, he said, well, nobody owns those cattle. I said, oh, so you don't own them? No, I don't own them, but nobody owns them. I was just selling them. Well, by Texas and Oklahoma law, they actually belong to the county in which they were in. And we took it to the grand jury and all the way through the court system and got a conviction on that, is stealing from the county. So those cattle should be reported within 5 days. The recommendation is to have them impounded. Don't leave them on your property. They will give you the option of that. Typically, if you've got them pinned up, you can drop them off at a sale barn and just tell them, hey, these are estrays. Make sure and call the sheriff's department. But you can't sell them at any point in there. You can't sell them. Where it gets difficult is there is a ruling in the estray that, let's just say that, well, I'm gonna back up one piece. It is always estray whether or not it's open ranged or closed range, whether there's a stock law or no stock law. Stock law and no stock law and open range, closed range are two different ways of saying the same thing. Open range is no stock law, and that is the default of Texas. Every county beginning in the 1800s had the option of that, each precinct calling for an election to implement a stock law, and that could be for each species and by precinct. So in theory, you could have a county that has one precinct with no stock law or open range, one precinct that has a stock law on horses, and one precinct that has a stock law on cattle. But as a general rule, most counties in the state of Texas, other than far west Texas, have a stock law. When you report those, you have 5 days to report. And then when those cattle are turned in, exhaustive search of the owner is made. Then they are advertised in a local publication twice in a 14-day period. And then 5 days after the second publication, they can be sold at a public market. There is a clause that they can sell them on the courthouse, but I don't recommend that. Going to a public market takes all liability out. But that's all to be done by the sheriff's department. And then when the sheriff's department sells those, they can reimburse if you had to have somebody come gather those, if you had to haul them, if you had feed, and then the impound fees, the advertising, sale, all that's pulled out. That money goes into escrow. in the county for 1 year in case an owner does show up. And at the end of that year, then it goes to the county jury fund to be used for the county's purpose.
Well, good answer, Scott. Our next question, and this is the last one we have for now. So if you have any questions in the meantime, be sure to drop them in the chat box or the Q&A box, or you can always email us after it ends. One of our last questions, who do we register the brand in our county? If we have a brand we want to register, where do we go?
County clerk's office. Just go into the courthouse, the county clerk's office, and they can register you there. And every county is, each county individually to that one clerk's office is registered. And as far as the bailouts, I think he was talking about, I'm assuming that the South Texas issues they have off the border. And if that's what it was, then we do often work with those because one thing is that's also considering that they're likely tearing down the fences or cutting fences that contain livestock, which is a felony offense in and of itself. So the guys down south do have a lot of interaction with that.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that we have. Oh, that's not true. We just had one come in. Are brands still registered every 10 years? I believe you answered that, Scott. Yes, they need to be re-registered every 10 years.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, if you have any further questions, you can definitely email membership@tstra.org, or you can find more information online. Scott, we surely appreciate you coming on and talking a little more about the Special Rangers today. Thank you to everyone who joined and watched our session, and we hope to see you again next month at our March session for grass and forage identification.